Will we see a global recession? Well, I've taken the view for a long time that a global recession was inevitable. For now, there are three key reasons: inflation, interest rates, and debt. So let's work through each of them. Well, the Russia-Ukraine war has unleashed inflation throughout the global economy. There has been a supply-side crunch. Natural gas is more expensive, so is oil. And this has led to increase in costs for transport, for fertilizers, for obviously oil and gas, for production of industry, and so on and so forth. Now remember, Russia doesn't just produce oil and gas, it produces nickel and copper and all sorts of commodities. So even clean energy costs are bound to go up. And the important thing to remember is that there is no big supplier of commodities available like that to fill in the gap. As inflation rises, obviously the second aspect kicks in, interest rates have to rise. For, I would say, decades, the US, Europe, Japan, and a few other prosperous economies have enjoyed a charmed life. We have lived in some sort of a Goldilocks economy, which simply means that low interest rates have not reflected in inflation. Generally, historically, when you have low interest rates, generally inflation can tend to rise, and you raise interest rates to control inflation, to bring it down. Now, what we are seeing is a reversion to that historic mean. The argument goes that, look, after 1991, there was a massive influx in the global labor pool. China joined the global labor market, particularly after 1992, when Deng Xiaoping went on his Nanxun, the southern tour. And in 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization, the WTO. This meant that China became the factory of the world. This meant there was a huge supply of commodities, whether it was ironing boards or kettles or all sorts of stuff, iron, steel, cement, you name it. Now, this meant actually that a rate of inflation that central banks were targeting was probably incorrect. The natural rate of inflation had gone down because of such a massive benign supply shock. Right now we are going through a malign supply shock. At that time, we went through a benign supply shock. Interest rates could afford to be low, and arguably it was those loose interest rates or those low interest rates that led to the 2001 crisis. And after that, of course, came the 2007-2008 crisis, and after that central banks followed a policy of quantitative easing, which is literally printing money, central banks buying assets, including corporate bonds. And this meant that there was a lot of money sloshing around in the economy. It did not reflect in inflation, but it led to asset market bubbles. And there is an argument to be made that quantitative easing was like the Spanish and the Portuguese finding silver in the New World. And few people know it, but it is important to know that a third of that silver that Portugal and Spain found in the New World, in modern-day Latin America, ended up in China. And in fact, it led to inflation in China because China had imposed the single whip law, wherein they collected all their taxes in silver, and it led to the collapse of the Ming dynasty. So we could be going through a similar phase in which this era of quantitative easing led to house prices going up and away, led to all sorts of bubbles forming, whether in cryptocurrencies or stocks. And that will all be punctured by rising interest rates, because now interest rates have to rise to keep the price of milk, bread, eggs, and butter, if you can afford it, in check. Now, as interest rates rise, you will see businesses go under, mortgages will go up. There'll be a lot of spillover effects. So those who have locked their mortgages into 30-year rates, they'll do fine. And those who haven't, well, tough luck. Now this brings us on to the third issue, which is debt. We know that apart from monetary easing, there was a massive fiscal loosening as well. What that simply means is that governments spent more than they earned. So in the COVID era, during the COVID era, governments gave away a lot of goodies, and arguably it was important. However, that meant that they were spending more than they earned. This meant that all these governments were running budget deficits and piling on debt. That was all right as long as interest rates were low. Now as interest rates rise, debt has become more expensive and will continually become more expensive. Servicing the debt will become more difficult. This means that indebted households will face trouble. This means that indebted individuals will face trouble. This means that indebted companies and countries will be in trouble. There are a number of emerging economies, developing countries, third world countries, whatever term you want to use, that are in trouble. Africa is going through a debt crisis. Latin America isn't doing much better. They've had a massive commodities crunch from China. Although commodity prices have gone up post the Russia crisis, what has happened is that Chinese economy has tanked thanks to Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. So there is less Chinese demand for, say, Brazilian beef or Brazilian soybean or Chilean copper. So all these countries in Latin America and in Africa face an earnings issue, and more importantly, their spending has gone up. They import their energy generally. That means their import bill has gone up. They have to borrow debt. Now they have to borrow debt at higher interest rates, and there is less money sloshing around in the markets. And so this is going to cause a massive squeeze on the global economy. So combining inflation, interest rates, and debt, we are headed for some very choppy waters. In fact, we probably might be looking at a prolonged global recession and a decade or so of low growth, if not stagnation. That is a grim scenario, but that is the scenario that almost was inevitable after the heady days of quantitative easing and fiscal loosening during the COVID era. The chickens have come home to roost.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.